jump into the trial. Good to be with y'all. So this is a particularly fun one because this is one that this is actually the story we know, but that is the trial. We all know this trial, but we don't realize that this is the version we're looking at most of the time, especially when it's dramatized in movies and things. So last week, again, we looked at the first 20 or so verses of chapter 18. That was the betrayal or the handing over of Jesus / the arrest, the interrogation by Ananias, the old chief priest, and the denial by Peter, right? So that was that opening part. Now we're going to look at a whole lot of things, but there are two things I want to focus on from last week that impact this week's. First is aulen. That's the Greek term for courtyard, and it has those connections back to the Good Shepherd narrative. If you remember, Jesus says, these are a sheep of my fold, but there are others who are not of this fold, and I will go to get them too. And then today is the trial before Pilate, and while the Synoptic Gospels have a big Sanhedrin trial, and usually the conversation with Pilate's pretty quick. It's pretty much are you a king? No, they beat him, they put the crown of thorns on him and present him, and there's that sort of back and forth, but there's no real moment. So John has no Sanhedrin trial at all. He has a very extended trial before Pilate. So that's why we're taking all of today just to look at one little part, because it has a whole lot going on in it. And then the Synoptics feature this very sympathetic view of Pilate. He's convinced of Jesus' innocence, or seems to be, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? But the Johannine Pilate is far more concerned with humiliating the Jews, creating division, and he's in a spot where he's literally caught between Jesus and the Jews, / really the religious authorities, as we'll see and talk about. He is literally going back and forth between them. And we'll see that it's actually, I'm not sure it's meant to be comedic, but it's certainly supposed to show us exactly how little power everyone has in the situation versus the power that Jesus ultimately had. So with all that in mind, the other word from last week is just that paradidomai, which we'll talk about again in a minute, that handing over. Judas is the one who hands over Jesus. We translate that word as betrayal, but it literally just means hand over, and so we'll see how that gets played out too. So beginning at the 20th verse of the 18th chapter, then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, and it was early in the morning, and they themselves, that is the religious authorities, the Jews, these are largely, we can read, Caiaphas and the soldiers, the temple guard, do not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." So Pilate said to them, "Well, take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. All right, so just about 4 or 5 verses, and we'll be going about 4 or 5 verses for all of these. So Caiaphas literally says nothing to Jesus because Caiaphas already said it, right? Back in the 10th chapter when he said this one man has to die to save the nation. He already had the Sanhedrin trial is back in the 10th chapter. We're just now catching up. And so Jesus then is, while he's led to Caiaphas, he is then in turn led into the headquarters, the praetorium of Pilate. And these are the interesting things. I always find it fascinating what they choose to translate and not translate. Every version I saw in English will translate praetorium into headquarters. But praetorium is literally just a Latin term that says, again, headquarters or the main area for Pilate. So we don't know why the homes of Gentiles would defile someone before the Passover. Some people think it might be because of how Gentiles handled either food or the dead. Either way, what we do know is that obviously this was an issue for the religious authorities. They wanted to be able to go home and have Passover with their family. And if you were defiled in this case, they claim it'd be about a week-long process to be ritually pure again. I don't know if all of that's accurate, but that's what some of the commentaries I read. All we can really say is just take that on face value. They didn't want to come in because there was an outward observance that they wanted to make there, right? And so these the Jews, as they're called constantly here, are really the religious authorities. And this is perfectly clear. There is no crowd, unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where they're inciting the crowd to respond. This is all not inside the praetorium, but right there in the, right outside in the garden outside of Pilate's house. And really, we should have in mind that there's about, I don't know, 5 to 15 people, maybe 20. Most of them either Caiaphas or other related authorities of the Sanhedrin. It is purely the leadership here. While we can go back and forth about what John means with the Jews at other points, this, because it's early in the morning, they haven't whipped up a crowd, they haven't done anything, they've just brought Jesus in after keeping him up all night and interrogating him, and they're going to have this conversation with Pilate. And it's really Pilate, Jesus, and the leadership, right? And so he refuses to come out of the praetorium. Pilate has to go out, right? So what we learned very quickly is the Jews are outside, literally outside. The praetorium is this area inside, and that's where Jesus is, right? He's brought in and bound. So Pilate is all business, and his basic question is, what's the charge? Why are you bringing this random guy to me? So we have to look at this. Sometimes it helps people to see it in terms of a map, right? So here's a little line in the middle. On the outside of the headquarters, outside of the praetorium, there are the Jews, the religious authorities, who can't come in because of ritual defilement. And then inside is Jesus, who's arrested and bound inside of Pilate's headquarters with perhaps his soldiers and other folks guarding him. Pilate then has to sort of go around. So Pilate here in verse 18, he has Jesus inside, but then he goes outside to have this conversation with the Jews to figure out what's going on, right? So that's the first movement, real fast. So if this man were not a criminal, he would not have handed him over to you. And so this is the second use of the term paradidomai. Before it was Judas who handed over Jesus to the Jews, to the religious authorities. Now the religious authorities have paradidomai, handed him over to Pilate. And then in Greek, there's this term that's it's a negative term that expects a negative answer. Like, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have handed him to you, which means, of course, he is a criminal, right? There's that double negative that means a positive in this case. But really, the answer is expected to be that negative. That, of course, he's a criminal. That's why we gave him to you. So Judas handed him over to the soldiers. Now they hand Jesus over to the Pilate. And then Pilate really wants nothing to do with it. This is pretty consonant with what we know about Pilate from the other historical records. He did not like Jews. He didn't like being in Palestine. He didn't like dealing with this stuff. So he gives a deeply political response. And he rejects this idea of like, oh, he was a criminal. And he was like, I don't really care. Y'all deal with him then. If he's a criminal, your courts can handle a criminal. Good luck. And the Jews' response, the Jewish authorities' response, that they can't put people to death is likely a political one, that they want Rome to do it for them on one hand, and on another hand, it's to say, oh, well, you guys are in charge, y'all want to do all this stuff, so y'all need to take care of it, right? But even more, what's the reference to fulfilling Jesus's death prediction? It says this was to fulfill what Jesus proclaimed about his death, right? Well, if it was a Jewish execution, it would have been stoning, while Roman is crucifixion. So when John says this was to fulfill the way he would die, it's not necessarily to say that it would be Rome who killed him, or Jews who killed him, or the Jewish authorities who killed him, but more importantly, that it would be crucifixion and not stoning. Okay. Anything else from those opening verses that we want to look at real fast? This goes pretty fast and furious, so. All right, we'll keep going then. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Do you ask this of your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Okay, so we have a nice exchange. Again, the first round, Pilate came outside to talk to the religious authorities. This time, Pilate is going to go back inside to talk to Jesus and have this conversation, right? So the second movement is all about coming back in and having this sort of semi-private conversation with Jesus about what's going on. And the seminal question really of this entire trial, which is true for John, but not for the synoptics, is, are you the king of the Jews? It's basil in Greek, or basil. That's where the word for the plant comes from. Basil is considered the king of plants. Or a basilica is the king of churches. It is a revered church, right? But the term king is used here something like 15 times, and it's only used 3 other times outside of this in conversation in the rest of the Gospel of John. So when literally they're talking about who's the king, who is in charge, it's all here. It's the question that is being asked of Pilate and even of the person reading and listening, right? Who is the king? Who is in charge here? Pilate and Jesus both use the same term again, paradidomai, again, which is to hand over. And so he is saying, "Oh, well, they handed me over to you. But if God didn't want me to be handed over, then I would have followers who would stop that. But God wants this, so this is how this is going to go." There's this sort of divine passive, as they call it, idea to it, right? That I was handed over, but it wasn't really their choice as much as it was God's foreordaining of the moment. So why was he handed over? What did he come for? To testify to the truth. And that means he's opposed to the world, right? That puts him in opposition. I said put in opposition to the world, or at least the authority of the world. So you have this clear theme that's running through here about who's in charge, and it's not who we think, right? Jesus is pretty clear, like, oh, you think you know who's in charge, but you don't seem to realize at all who is in charge, who is the king, who is controlling the situation. And in this chapter, then, we have Malchus. That's the guy who gets his ear cut off, right? That's the Hebrew term for king, who has an ear removed. Jesus is referred to as king, Basil, and then later we'll have Caesar, the Latin term for king. So in case you aren't getting it, they say it in every single language that's spoken in Palestine. Hey, there's this guy named King who gets his ear chopped off, and Jesus is the king. And then there's this Caesar emperor guy who is a king. You got lots of kings really, really fast. And John's pretty much beating us over the head. If you can't hear it, you aren't paying attention, kind of thing. And then in this whole thing, you can absolutely hear Pilate's disdain for the Jews, and not just the religious authorities, for all Jews. Josephus was the Jewish historian of the era, and he has lots of stories about how Pilate hated the Jews. He is one of the people who's independent of the New Testament, who talks about Pilate a good deal and how Pilate really did not have a good relationship with the Jewish community at any level at any time. So you can hear that disdain when he's like, "I'm not a Jew. Why should I care about this at all?" Right? And we should hear that not as an attempt to find Jesus innocent, but as someone who's really just sort of disgusted with the whole situation more than anything else. And again, Pilate's not sympathetic. He has to deal with the Jewish problem he wants no part of. He just wants to get out of the situation. So what we'll see over and over again is he's looking not to declare Jesus innocent or his guilt. He just wants to be done with this waste of his morning, quite frankly. Right? I think that's the best way we should probably see Pilate. What else do we hear in those first two movements, right? Jesus is arrested and brought in, and then Pilate starts the interrogation. What, is there other things you hear or see?
I would never pick up on all of the language, innuendo and symbolism if you don't know the translation or the words from which these are derived.
Right. The king, and yeah, there's lots of these king words, but yeah, it's hard to know it. All right, well, we'll keep marching along then. So after Pilate had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? And they shouted and replied, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was bandit. So Pilate declares Jesus not guilty. I find no case against this man. He hadn't done anything that I can tell. He doesn't really even seem to think he's a king. He's not declaring it to me. I'm moving on with my day. Thanks. Why don't you just, I have, there's a tradition. We have this moment with Barabbas in all four Gospels. We have nothing that's independent of Scripture that says that this was a true tradition of Pilate, or, to release someone at Passover, but we also have no reason to doubt it. I mean, people get very anxious when there's not another record of something, but this is one, it's such a weird tradition, and it carries over in all four Gospels. It seems like it would make sense that it is a actual historical moment. But again, Pilate's mocking the leadership. Hey, I brought this. Hey, you want your king? I got him inside. You want your Basil, the king of the Jews? Which obviously Pilate doesn't believe him to be a king. He doesn't believe the accusations are worth his time. That's why he's declared him not guilty. I don't see a reason to charge him, and I'll go get your king. And he's pretty much making fun of the religious authorities gathered, right? Who brought him in. In the Synoptics, who do you want, Jesus or the Son of God or Barabbas? Barabbas is Hebrew, and it means son of a father. So you want a son of the father or son of a father? There's a play on words there that happens as well. Right? This Barabbas guy is the son of a random father. Abba is just father in Hebrew. Bar is son of. And that's, of course, that's my favorite thing that always happens. And whenever I do a stump the chump with a youth group and say, hey, ask me any question you want, ask the priest any question you want, usually it almost happens every time, right? Someone will ask, what was Jesus's middle name? And the answer is Bar. That is, he would be Jesus Bar Yosef. That would be Jesus, son of Joseph, right? That would be most likely how he was referred to in the ancient world. You didn't have a surname, but they would name who your father was. So Bar was most likely Jesus's middle name, if anyone ever asks. It's not hate or hates, as people want it to be. That's usually why the youth group's asking me that question, trying to get me to rise. But anyway, so that's one thing that's happening. But in this one, it's not, the concern about Barabbas is not the same. In the Synoptics, there's very much this term where it's like, do you want the son of God or the son of a random father, right? The son of the father or the son of a random father. Here, in John, the emphasis is on bandit. He was a bandit. Lestis is the term in Greek, and it's the same term as the one who steals the sheep or attacks them. So if you remember when Jesus declares, I am the good shepherd, and I have my sheep, and they're in their aulin, and their pen, in their courtyard, in their area. And then there are those who want to come in and steal the sheep or attack them or devour them. And that's lestes. It's the same term there as it is here. Right? And so you have this very clear situation where Pilate is putting in front of them, do you want the good shepherd or do you want the bandit? And of course, they pick the bandit. They pick the one who breaks in and kills and devours the sheep. not the Good Shepherd. So a lot of there's a lot of conversation and scholarship that really a lot of what that is happening here with the arrest and trial is about how people are rejecting the Good Shepherd, rejecting the right one. Any other questions about that particular part? And this again, Pilate has now come back outside. I don't know. I thought I had another little. I left it off. Anyway, so Pilate came outside to talk to the religious authorities, and he went inside to talk to Jesus. Now he's going back outside. So this is the third movement of Pilate in this story. He literally bounces back and forth over and over again between Jesus inside and the religious authorities outside. All right, so looking to the next part, we know this part. We've seen it a million times. This shows up in all the Gospels. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," striking him on the face. All right, so Pilate, again, the first movement, Pilate went outside to talk to the religious authorities. Then he went in and talked to Jesus. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Then he went back outside to talk to the Jews and say, "Do you want Barabbas, the bandit, or do you want the Good Shepherd?" Effectively, and they say, "We want the bandit." And so Pilate then goes back inside to have Jesus beaten and abused. Right? So here's 4 moves already of Pilate. Again, I don't know that it's supposed to be comedic, but we definitely should get the idea that Pilate is running back and forth trying to negotiate a settlement that he doesn't want to deal with, right? It sort of begins, you start to go, well, who's in charge here? Because this guy is supposed to be in charge, but he's running back and forth like a chicken with his head cut off. So while the other movements make it explicitly clear that Pilate went out or inside, right? The first one, 2 or 3, they says, and then Pilate went inside, and then he went outside. This one is just Jesus-centric. So Pilate took Jesus, who was inside, and had him flogged. But then when we talk about the next one, it says, oh, then Pilate went outside. So if he was going back outside, he had to be inside, right? It's sort of logical. But all that said, this moment where Jesus is beaten is in all the Gospels. It's in Matthew and Luke, where it's 39 lashes, 1 short of execution by flogging. And in those moments in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's really this idea that, again, Pilate believes in the innocence of Jesus in those Gospels, or seems to, and is trying to have him punished but not kill him, right? Like, well, maybe if I just beat him, then they'll leave him alone, kind of thing. But John has totally reframed it. It's not about getting Jesus bloody. Instead, it's much more about, if the issue is who is the king, then this is a mocking moment to say, like, well, here's a king, woohoo! And it's much more about putting the robe on him and the crown on him, and this really dramatic irony and mockery and clothing the true king in these false images of kingship. And the other ones, there's only one time that it's really being asked, who is the king? We've now had about 10 references to kings, and we got more to go. So it's much more, and literally this is the middle of the trial, where he puts these images of kingship on Jesus and is mocking him. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's the last thing that happens before they send Jesus off to be crucified, right? And by moving this to the middle of the story, it's just reinforcing this question of who is the king, who is in charge, who is this Jesus guy? Is he the good shepherd? Is he the bandit? Is he the good king? Is he something else? All right, let me pause there. As we've talked about going in and out and the trial and how it's going, anything else we want to look at or talk about in these particular verses? They're really short because it is just literally like a handful of lines, 2 or 3 verses for each movement, but they've got a lot happening.
You said that 40 lashes was the sentence for when you would be death by lashing.
Right.
And he had 39. Was the 40th the magic one, or they just didn't stop at 40 and kept going?
I think they just didn't stop at 40 and kept going. They would say 40 lashes, and I think they just beat you till you were a bloody mess and more or less weren't going to make it.
Mm. Mm.
But and that's one of those that's from a lot of different commentaries I've seen, but I don't know how historically accurate that is or how much that's tradition. I mean, this is the thing about our faith, that there's a number of things, especially around the crucifixion sequence, that are told, and then scholarship has recently started to unravel some of those things. That is just to say that, well, 40 lashes meant he had a lot of lashes, right? Or 39 meant he had a lot, but not as many as a whole lot. There's all those sort of biblical numbers that get in there, and it's hard to know how much of that was historical record and how much of that is just to say they beat him a whole lot.
Well, the bottom line is he was beaten so much that by the time they put him on the cross, he was 2/3 of the way through.
Right. Well, and that's true for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but in this case, Pilate has him flogged, but that's clearly not the emphasis, right? It's one line. Then there's two additional lines about putting him in a purple robe, giving him the crown of thorns, and hailing him as King of the Jews, right?
Yeah.
And the other ones, it is much more about Jesus, like, to make you vultures happy, I will flog him, all these kinds of other lines about why I'm going to beat him and knock him down and do all these horrible things to him. This is much more a parody of kingship than it is about the beating in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it just all goes back to these ideas constantly of saying, are you a king? Who's a king? What is kingship? My kingship is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. All those kinds of back and forth comments about what does it mean to be a king. So the other thing we have to note is randomly we just switched to the 19th chapter of John. All of our numbers for the Bible came from a monk, and I think it was like the 16th century, who finally said they couldn't figure out ways to bind things in the chapter together, and a monk randomly came up with this idea of having chapter and verse. Generally speaking, that monk did a great job with dividing up things so that, like, a story would end, like the 17th chapter would be the story, and then it would end and transition to something else. He did not do a good job here, because about 15 verses in chapter 18 for the interrogation, and then another 15 or 20 in chapter 19. It's a strangely divided process. I don't know what the monk was looking at when he made these choices, or he was getting tired after all the first 4 books, or maybe he did the Old Testament and New Testament. He was worn out by now.
Yeah. Maybe he was working late into the night and had a little too much of the brew they made at the monastery.
It could be that too. Yes.
Because they didn't drink the water. They couldn't.
Nope.
I think it's really interesting that in the midst of this discussion, or this dialogue between Jesus and Pilate, that Jesus, interjects this issue of truth, so that he answers the question, you say that I am a king. Right. But then he goes on to say, for this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate says, what is the truth? It's as if maybe, as you say, there have been all these discussions of all the king, the concept of kingship keeps coming up. And we see these sort of false kings. And then Jesus says, I came into the world to testify to the truth. To me, when you put that in the midst of all this dialogue about kingship, the gospel writer must be saying to us, what's the real truth about kingship?
Absolutely. Yeah. That servant leader is more akin to what we need than the authoritative kingship that we proclaim, right? Or will look to. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's part of it. Barabbas, we got Pilate going in and out, in and out. So, continuing with 19:4, Pilate went out again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law. According to that law, he ought to die because he is claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. So, inside, outside, inside, outside, and now Jesus and Pilate come outside. This is the fifth round of going between those, going in and out that same door or going around the corners or whatever it is. And this is that famous moment, of course, that is usually most dramatically. It's one of the most painted portraits of the Renaissance. Ecce homo, behold the man. Even though it's written in Greek, in Latin it would have been ecce homo, behold the man. And again, here is someone dressed as a king, beaten, bloody, and yet more than a man. Like, here is truth to a certain degree, like Lynn was saying. And then Pilate, again, for the second time, declares Jesus not guilty. I find no case against this man. Which is not necessarily to say he finds him innocent. He doesn't find any reason to do anything to him. Maybe innocent of the charge, but that's not the term is ever used here. He's not innocent. He's just, I don't find a reason to mess with this guy. So then, again, this is just the leaders, and they make it very clear. It's the chief priests and the soldiers. There is no group of people there beyond that group. That's the only ones that are ever described as being present. Demand that Jesus be crucified, right? Again, Pilate, even as they declare they wanted to crucify, Pilate for a third time says that he's not guilty. I don't see a reason to kill this man. You do it. I'm not getting involved. Which is not necessarily someone who finds, if you found someone truly innocent, at least in today's day and age, and I'm pretty sure in the first century too, if you really thought innocent or believed in this person, then you would protect them from the mob. Pilate's decision to just go like, you go kill him, is not necessarily say that he's believes in Jesus pro or con. It's just, I'm sick of dealing with all of you. I don't want to deal with any of this. Pilate is just not interested in handling it. So while Pilate has expressed he doesn't want to be involved in petty Jewish rivalries, and he doesn't think Jesus is a king, he certainly doesn't think Jesus is much more either. Just take him away, do whatever you want. If you want to kill him, fine, but I don't want to deal with this anymore. You're ruining my morning. I want to get to breakfast or whatever it is. And so in the synoptics, the accusation is really tax evasion. That's what they accused Jesus. He testified that he shouldn't pay taxes. The clear charge in the Gospel of John is heresy. He declares that he is the Son of God. He declares that he's God. Either way, we're supposed to kill anyone who claims to be God or commits heresy, which is actually accurate in Judaism. That is a representation of Jewish law then and now. You're not supposed to do that. However, this is, at least from our perspective, if we've been reading the whole gospel, we know from the beginning that Jesus is God. So it's a perverse inversion of what we understand to be the real truth here, right? They recognize that he claims that he's God, but they do not accept it or him, which of course is an echo there from the very beginning, from the prologue. He came to his own and they did not accept him. came to them testifying to who he was, and they did not accept him. So we should know from the very beginning, from the prologue, that this is going to happen. But if you didn't, here it is. Here's that moment where they have reversed it. And the other question, of course, is what is Pilate afraid of, right? I mean, there is this moment where they say he has to die because he claims to be the Son of God, and Pilate heard this. He was more afraid than ever, but he doesn't seem to be afraid. I'm not sure where the fear is in that one.
It's interesting to me. Now, you're saying it was just those religious leaders that were saying crucify him?
Oh, yeah. So in the Gospel of John, it is only that group.
Because, see, I had this feeling that there was this huge crowd of people. You know, they show you that in those movies that they make, and there's all this huge crowd that's all yelling, crucify him, crucify him.
Right. Well, there is the huge crowd. If you read Matthew and Luke, you have much more of the idea that this is almost a public trial in front of a very different building, and that it's all kinds of different people who are out there yelling like that. And so if you were purely looking at the Matthew and Luke and maybe even Mark, they seem to be much more of like the huge crowd. It's just that in this case, purely the religious authorities who brought Jesus in, and it literally says the chief priests. So we should see Annas and Caiaphas and a handful of guards out there waiting for Pilate to take care of the business they wanted to take care of. But it's different. It's definitely not, and it's where we've conflated things a whole lot sometimes and hear things that aren't quite there because we've heard it in the other Gospels, but it's not what the record says in this one.
I mean, the scene you described with Pilate going back and forth kind of reminds me of a mediator, where you have two different groups who can't agree, and the mediator keeps going back and forth to see if he can come up with something that both sides can agree to.
Right.
The other thing, I think there's a footnote about in the Oxford Study Edition, saying in essence, calling out the irony of it was it was ritual impurity needed to be avoided, but it was okay to kill the Son of God. Right,
exactly. I don't want to get dirty, but I'm happy to kill people. What's really impurity here? Walking in somebody's living room or or murder? Huh. Okay. Interesting. All right. Got a little bit more. So he entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." So, hey, look, there we go. And again, so now 6 times we've gone in and out of this building. Pilate should be getting dizzy, if nothing else, mediator otherwise. 6 times, Pilate has bounced between Jesus and the Jews' religious authorities. And then Pilate asks this sort of seminal question that the Gospel of John is concerned with, right? Who is Jesus? Where is he from? If we've been reading and listening, we know he is from God. We know he is with God. We know he is God, right? Where is he from? He's God. But if you're Pilate, you're more worried about was he born in Bethlehem and Nazareth and Judea? And the Gospel of John pointedly does not answer the where he's from question because that doesn't matter. Like the hometown is not the issue. The issue is he's God. Then Pilate declares, despite running around in circles, but despite being a mediator and not really seeming to have a firm leg to stand on, goes, well, I have all the power, though. And even though he's pretty much demonstrated he didn't have any power, he's not in control. Nothing he has done is really said, oh, this is a guy in charge of the situation. He's like, hey, we all do this. Oh, we want to do this. I mean, he's just literally begging people to leave him alone and do not have to deal with it. It is not someone who seems to have a whole lot of power or authority. He believes he has it, but he doesn't seem to be able to control it. And then unsurprisingly, Jesus tells him the only power he has is God. People think this is in all four Gospels. It is only here. It is only in the Gospel of John that this exchange is. And again, it's because they've had the whole question of who is king, who has got power, who is in control, right? And there's this whole question back and forth again: who's got the power, who's got the control, who's the king, and what does it mean to be a king? All these kinds of questions of authority are being brought up, which Jesus, unsurprisingly, goes, "You got nothing, buddy. You think you do, but you don't have any control." Then Jesus makes a different designation. The one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin, and it is paradidomai. Here's the last use of that term. The one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. So the fundamental question then is, which one? Because there were a bunch of guys handing Jesus over. Right? Tradition has often held that it's Judas, because he was the one, of course, who handed Jesus over to Caiaphas and Annas. But then at the same time, if you're talking strictly literally, the person who handed him directly to Pilate is Caiaphas and Annas. So is it the religious authorities have that sin? Is it Judas? Is it both? Where does it fall, right? And we don't have an answer. There's not. Are all guilty? Is one guilty? Is sort of left to us. Which one who handed over Jesus is guilty of the greater sin, right? Pilate is clearly not the one guilty of the greater sin. He's just stuck in the situation, according to Jesus. The guys who knew what they were doing, who knew Jesus was God, that make the bigger error. Then finally, Pilate tries to release him, but they declare, you are no friend of Caesar. Right? These are funny things we choose to translate. They chose to translate Caesar as emperor, but it's very much Caesar in the text. You are no friend of Caesar. It's important to know a friend of Caesar was a title in the Roman Empire. All right? So if you were a friend of Caesar, you were basically a knight of the empire, of the Roman Empire. You had a certain echelon. You were part of the landed nobility. You were one of the important guys. You were particularly close to the ruling class and, of course, the emperor. So it did mean that you were a friend of Caesar, like, oh, I'm a buddy. But it even more meant, oh, you were particularly loyal to the emperor, right? It was a both and kind of thing. And so Caiaphas is playing hardball. He's saying, hey, your choice to support a king in opposition to your king, Caesar, is unfriendly to the king, and we will make that accusation and get you fired as governor of Palestine, Judea. If it gets back to Caesar that you wouldn't put a king to death, which is your job, then you're no friend of Caesar, and we should read that as the pun and act that it is. Caiaphas is mocking him as his title and mocking that relationship with the emperor of Rome, right? The Caesar. Caiaphas is playing these politics to get his way, and Pilate chooses to die in another ditch. Basically, if you're gonna do that, if you're gonna rat me out to the boss, then fine, kill him. I don't care. I'm not dying for this guy. I'm not losing my authority or putting myself in a position where someone could say that I didn't put an insurrection king to death, as is my job, right? Caiaphas has boxed him in effectively, politically. Anything about that? Again, and here's that other side, right? Now here's Caesar is brought in. We've talked about Malchus in the arrest. Then we had Basil, the king in Greek. Now we're going to reference the emperor, the man who thinks he's in charge of the world. Caesar is brought in, and who's a friend of which king, who is in charge, all gets mixed together here. All right, so the last turn, and then we can talk about all of it. When Pilate heard these words, again, he folds like a cheap tent. He brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench, a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. And he said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Really what they say, not the emperor. "We have no king but Caesar." And then he handed them over to them to be crucified. And yes, that's paradidomai again. Everybody's handing Jesus over. All right, so just so you can look at all of it, the beginning, Pilate goes outside to talk to the Jews. He comes in to talk to Jesus. He goes out to talk to the Jews. He goes in to talk to Jesus. He brings Jesus outside. Then he goes inside to beat him. Then he brings Jesus outside one last time for the judgment. 7 movements of Pilate going back and forth. 7 times, which of course is a sacred number, but it's also just shows you how little authority Pilate seems to have and how much he is being played by pretty much everybody. You see this dizzying story. Pilate is literally ping-ponging between Jesus and the religious authorities. He's not an agent or leader, but someone torn between extremes who doesn't seem to understand either. And it's brilliant storytelling is what it really is. I mean, we can talk about a whole host of things, but it's just a brilliant way to tell a story. If you're paying attention, just go like, man, Pilate doesn't seem to have any authority, even though he is the authority, right? He is acting in the place of Caesar. He is the agent of Rome. He can literally kill people. And again, if you read the stories about from Josephus, there are moments where literally he will put 100 Jews on a cross in a day because they were all fighting him and he just got sick of them. He wasn't afraid to kill anybody or do anything. But the story, the way it's told without being completely confrontational, makes it very clear that Pilate is not as fearful of enemy as you might expect. John's not done. He then creates this brilliant ambiguity. Pilate comes out with Jesus and he sat down on the judgment seat. We translate it often enough as he sat him down on the judgment seat, but there is no direct object there. It's just he sat down on the judgment seat. That could mean either Jesus was sat down on the judgment seat or Pilate was put on the judgment seat, right? So Pilate could have sat down on the judgment seat to announce his judgment, or Jesus could have been placed in the judgment seat so that Pilate could continue to mock him as the king of the Jews. Right? Understand that the judgment seat is where Christ will sit, right? As our judge in the future, Christ will come as our judge. But does anybody else know where the term judgment seat comes up? I'll ask Glenn. I'm going to ask the EFM guy. Do you know where the judgment seat is? Oh, you're mute, but that's okay. I think you said no, I don't.
I thought I flicked it off. I do not.
So the judgment seat, there's obviously a literal place in like the basilicas and in those places where a judge would sit and announce his judgment, or where Pilate would sit and announce his judgment. But in the Jewish terminology, it's the cover for the Ark of the Covenant.
Oh, wow.
Cover for the Ark, between the space between the cherubim there is the judgment seat. It is the judgment seat of God. So when we talk about one day God will be in his judgment seat, that is the literal terminology for what's between the angels on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, which is where God rests in ancient Jewish thought, right? That's where God was, so that was the judgment seat. So John, again, is playing with this imagery of who's in charge and when and where, right? He sat down on the judgment seat could well mean Pilate sat down and announced his judgment to the world that Jesus should be put to death. It more likely means, again, this play on imagery of who's in charge. Jesus is ultimately in charge. He is God. He is the one who will be on the judgment seat. That seat there on the top of the ark. Again, he's in his royal robes, and he's creating this sort of pun of sorts that Jesus is God and on his judgment seat, as I just said. It's also who is the real person in authority, right? So all that's in there. Finally, the biggest moment, and I think it was Rowan Williams who pointed this out, Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams, which was the previous one before Justin, makes this note that Caiaphas refused to go in because it would defile him, right? That's what he says at the beginning. The authorities refused to go in to the praetorium because that would defile them. The climax of the Passover ritual is, we have no king but God. That is what the great statement is in Judaism. We don't have a king. We don't worship, in that case, right? When they're talking about the Passover, it is, we don't have a pharaoh. We don't have a king, that kind of kingship, but God. And then Caiaphas creates the ultimate blasphemy by saying, we have no king but Caesar. He ignores the lesson that he will say that very night. We have no king but God. They have now rejected God, and they have said instead, we will serve Caesar. You have this incredibly dramatic moment at the conclusion where Caiaphas has unintentionally defiled himself far more, as Len was saying, right, with murder, but even more now he is creating blasphemy by saying, I have no king but Caesar, is to go, what? That is the last thing you're supposed to say in this moment. It is literally, we have no king but God, not we have no king but Caesar.
That was what occurred to me, because when you think about the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly sort of the Deuteronomistic take on them, you get this story of, back to, when the people decided they wanted a king. And I guess it was Samuel who says, this is really a bad idea.
You don't want a king.
God is your king. You really should. But if you really want to have a king, you can have a king, but it's going to get you a lot of trouble. And so you've got this whole strain of, really our king is God. It's not Saul or David or Josiah or whomever. It's really God. And then here, it's sort of self-condemnation to say, oh, we have no king but Caesar.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a long list of folks that get in trouble for being kings, instead of it being, there aren't a lot of good ones. I'll say it that way, right? 2 or 3 that even halfway get compliments, and even then they're a hot mess. So it is not something that human kingship does not seem to go well.
And this whole thing with Pilate, I mean, even though he claims to have all this power, he was so easily manipulated in this situation.
Yes.
I mean,
Well, there was a group out to kill him, and that was all there was going to be. And it's not even crowd psychology, because you had a small concentrated group of these religious authorities who were after him, and there was really no crowd going on.
But Pilate was not strong enough to ultimately stand up to them and say, this man's not guilty, and nothing will be done to him. But
he has no authority.
He just didn't have a good soap to wash his hands with.
Yeah.
Right. And he washes his hands in the others. Doesn't wash his hands here.
Yeah.
Because it almost implies that he has enough power to give it up. In this case,
What do you attribute the unique differences between the 3 books and this one? Why are they so different?
I mean, I think the best one that I've heard, the best explanation is really that John is creating a theological history of what's going on, more than he is worried about a literal telling. Like, for instance, in the Gospel of Luke, he literally writes in part of the opening, this is to write down an orderly account of all that has happened, right? He's really, his goal for the Gospel of Luke and Acts is to write down, like, here's what happened, here are the facts, and I've talked to the people, and this is what the report is. John's much more concerned about making a theological declaration that Jesus is God, and that here are moments that prove it, than necessarily things that are all, and they may be factual, but they just are, it's a very different series of stories and events. There's no parables, all that kind of stuff is just a whole different way of talking about Jesus. So they'll say it's a different tradition, which I think that's accurate, but I do think a big part of that is just a group of people trying to say, no, this is a theology. And so a lot of times, actually not a lot of times, it is universally agreed that if you want to talk about the history of what happened, then you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you want to understand the theology of the church, you read John. John is the theology of the church. Because this is where we talk about Jesus being God. I mean, Mark, Jesus is going, don't tell anybody I'm the Messiah. He's not calling himself God. He's like, don't even tell them I'm the Messiah. And in the Gospel of John, it's, oh no, I'm God and I'm in charge. Start to finish, all the way through. It's a very different conversation.
It's about what John is, the gospel writer is writing about what Jesus means to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, whereas Mark asks the reader to decide,
Right.
Who is Jesus?
Yeah, who do you think he is?
Interesting.
I would have loved to have been in the conversations at the Nicene Council when they were deciding which of these books would be what in what order.
Or maybe not.
They were wrestling with it, that's for sure. So next week, we'll look at the crucifixion. That's really the balance of the 19th chapter of John. The big thing that happens, as much as anything, not to give it away, but John, again, he shifts the timing. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Last Supper happens and it's the Passover meal. This is the day of preparations. We just saw it's the 12th hour or 12 o'clock on the day of preparation when Jesus is condemned. And we'll talk about some of what that means next week. But I guess the real question is, do we want to meet next week? It's the December 23rd. I can do it. That's fine. How's everybody else's schedule? Are people doing Christmas stuff and need to get ready? Do we want to wait? The next time after that would be the 6th of January. I mean, we can take 2 weeks off. We can meet next week. I'm fine either way. We have a vote here.
Well, I could make it, but we may get more folks if we do it, if we hold on until the 6th, but it's okay. I could do it.
Doesn't matter to us.
We'll be here.
All right. What about you, Karen?
I'll be here, but I don't really know if Peyton's planning to come.
Right.
We're kind of up in the air. So I guess I would lean toward waiting till the 6th as well. But I can do either. I'll do whatever everybody wants to do.
Well, we'll just wait till the 6th. I think that'll be fine. And then we can spend some time just going through. It's really the balance of the 19th chapter of John is the crucifixion, and we'll talk about that 1 week. And then chapter 20 is the resurrection narrative. And that's actually the ending of the Gospel of John, except for there's a 21st chapter that clearly is an addendum that they added at some point. And so we got about 3, maybe 4 more sessions that we can do in January. And then we can talk about what we want to do next too. So that'll be fine. We'll do it that way. Well, great, y'all.
6. Okay.
Anything else we want to look at, engage, do?